So today is the third lecture on news. We've talked about how news is structured by rules and values, the way news is put together, by principles, by commercial principles, commercial assumptions. We've talked about human subjective reasons for selecting news, political reasons, commercial reasons. And so all of the ideas now come together in the context of international news. And traditionally in the English language speaking world, a journalist who reports international news, remember we talked about news beat, yeah? The foreign news beat. A correspondent is a traditional word for a journalist, yeah? So the word correspond means a connection, or arguably not a connection, if we're talking about something foreign, between the subject and the object, yeah? This is the basic theory that I put forward at the beginning of the course, yeah? What does a foreign correspondent do? What is international news? And I'm going to introduce, I kind of jokingly suggested last week, maybe I wasn't joking, that you all had a look at my PhD thesis online, so I hope you all had a good sleep. Did it help you sleep? No? Yeah.
Tonight.
Pardon?
Tonight.
Tonight, maybe. Yeah. So if you looked at that, you'll notice that one of the main research findings was that there are two kinds of British foreign correspondent working in the who are most recognised as being good at what they do, or at least were good at what they're still working, most of them. There are the BBC objective foreign correspondent, and there are the politically subjective foreign correspondents, what I particularly categorise as politically subjective foreign correspondents, who in my thesis are people like Robert Fisk and John Pilger. And John Pilger, I'm going to mention one or two of his quotations, one or two things that he said to me in the interview that I conducted with him for my research, plus pick up on a really interesting documentary that he made a few years ago about the relationship of the news media to the reporting of Iraq, called The War You Don't See. John Pilger is not only a massively brilliant critical foreign correspondent, but he's also a documentary filmmaker who has very, very strong views about so-called objective BBC foreign correspondents. So the first thing is a little bit of political background for those of you that don't know, but I imagine most of you will know some of this background, but certainly the background will become clearer as a result of your UMW classes that you'll be having for the next few weeks. And this is the historical relationship between colonialism and foreign correspondence. As I say, in my research, I'm really interested in updating the notion of foreign in foreign correspondence. The very institution in which we are now, in which I work, in which you are paying to be students, was founded 100 years ago as a training institute for British diplomats. 100 years ago, the world was a very different place, and the so-called British Empire hadn't quite finished. In fact, it was still. So the founding principles of SOAS, the School of Oriental, remember Oriental is a Western stereotyping of East and Middle East Asia and South Asia, that it's still called SOAS. We need to reflect on that. Why is it still got why have we still got a colonial name for this institution? Yeah, we're still using that as a brand, and it's a colonial name, right? SOAS is now trying from the bottom up, from students and from staff, to decolonize right, to be more open about its relationship with the non-West, and one of the great things about SOAS is it has probably the highest proportion of non-white staff in any university in the country, or so I've heard. These are all ways that SOAS is trying to update and challenge its colonial historical origins. But even within the field of foreign correspondent journalism, colonialism is still there. It's still embedded in a Western thought process. It's even embedded in some foreign correspondents, like the ones that work at Al Jazeera, who start in the BBC and then, end up working for a foreign news company, but they have the same professional values as a BBC foreign correspondent. I'm not trying to say BBC is bad and John Pilger is good, because actually I think the truth quite, as is often the case, is more complex and is in the middle. They're two ways of approaching foreign correspondence on a continuum. They have different approaches, and I think we need a little bit of both of them. So let's just start off with some basic historical facts. Yes? Colonialism is a relationship between an indigenous or forcibly imported majority and a minority of foreign invaders. Yeah? Colonialism is embedded in the English language. The word foreign is a demarcation of not us. Right? The fundamental decisions affecting the lives of colonized people are made and implemented by the colonial rulers in pursuit of interests that are defined back home in the centres of power, such as London or Paris or other European capitals. So colonialism means rejecting cultural compromises. It means a kind of cultural Western superiority. And it means using the media, using psychological and social assumptions to report what's happening over there for our people back home. One of the big important functions of being a foreign correspondent is not just witnessing what's happening in a foreign country, it's imagining who your audience is. So as a British foreign correspondent, you're imagining, I need to tell the story for a British audience, and therefore you're changing the story. You are translating the story. You're mediating the story. Yeah? Colonial and imperial powers, countries, groups of people, etc., othered. Actually, maybe we should rename SOAS the School of Other and Alienation Studies. Don't you think that would be better? Othered or alienated places they wanted to dominate to legalise their exploitation of the land. During the rise of colonialism, details of which, as I said, you're learning on UMW, Western power perspectives of the East, so Oriental perspectives, as the other, represented it as different and separate from the civilized, liberal Western norms. So this is about representing the other as other without giving voice to the other. You are all from non-Western countries, without exception. Okay? There is something embedded in what you're doing now about learning English in an English-speaking context. Yeah? English has become the lingua franca of empire. The British colonial empire, now the American colonial empire. Yeah? So this is why we can still talk about colonialism. We can talk about post-colonialism. Yeah? The way you are represented, your cultures are represented, still has a kind of it's still controlled by a Western hegemonic thought process, yeah, which is ultimately racist. Another way of understanding colonialism is racism. So, news media reporting from foreign colonized territory, foreign correspondents, played a central role in violently othering colonized people in Africa, Asia, and South America, encouraging racism, justifying slavery, using propaganda to promote just wars. The example that I'm going to share with you later, The War You Don't See, is about Iraq. It's about how the Western media co-opted the whole of the English language Western-speaking world and sold the war on Iraq in 2003 as a good means of delivering liberalism and democracy to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, yeah, instead of a brutal breach of international law that led to the deaths of many millions of innocent Iraqi civilians. Yeah, it's one of the things that is really important to understand about foreign correspondence, and I'll come back to this in a moment, is that, you know, just almost cliches, if the Western media wasn't so good at justifying foreign wars for exploitation and power, then they wouldn't take place. Yeah. So a lot of foreign correspondent news is the reporting of wars. Wars in which the West has a direct or indirect political agency, and often the war is painted as a good thing from the perspective of the West. We talked about last week syntagms and paradigms and the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist. This is how the colonialism comes up through the language. Yeah, you sell the war, you promote the war. Yeah, and you often take out the Western historical context of why the West is involved in the war. A perfect example of this is Yemen at the moment. Yemen is basically being reduced to millions of children and families are starving in Yemen because it's being attacked by Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is a proxy of the West in this war. Saudi Arabia is being supplied by the West, with weapons by the West, and America primarily. But this is never the way the Yemen war is reported. It's reported almost like it's a natural disaster. You're not given the military political interests of America and the relationship between America and Saudi Arabia, which also coincides with the Khashoggi story that we were talking in the seminars this week. Why is this story so high up in the news agenda at the moment? Yeah. So this is one of the things that John Pilger talks about a lot when he attacks so-called objective BBC journalism. It just does not give you an accurate historical context. It often uses emotion to cover up facts, yeah? Which is an advertising technique. We're going to look at some examples in a moment. So, the way that the news media, others colonized people in Africa, Asia, and South America, justifying racism, is that it uses triumphalism and heroism. So it's very much like the West is doing a service to these foreign people. We are delivering good values, even though through violence we will enable democracy and liberalism. And take a look at the recent examples in the Middle East, like Syria and Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, none of these countries has particularly benefited at all from the Western military interventions, but the way it's been reported has not reflected that. That's the propaganda. So don't assume that so-called objective foreign correspondent reporting is objective. Don't assume that it's truthful. It is often in line with Western foreign policy and propaganda. And one part of the way it does this is that Western foreign correspondents that report foreign wars are often seen as heroes or act like heroes. Yeah? Like an individual hero in a Hollywood film script. And this diverts public attention from the actual real brutality, the rapaciousness, the violence of war. Modern colonialism started with the European age of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. Portugal and Spain discovered new lands across the oceans and built trading posts or conquered large extensions of land. These new lands were divided between the Portuguese and Spanish empires. The 17th century saw the creation of the French colonial empire and the Dutch empire, as well as the English overseas possessions, which later became the British Empire. It also saw the establishment of a Danish colonial empire and some Swedish overseas colonies. This is all on Moodle. You don't need to write this down. I think it's really important that you have some historical background before I give you the contemporary examples of British foreign correspondence. One of the examples that we're going to look at is the foreign correspondent reporting of the Rwandan genocide in, I think it was 1997. So it's very important to recognise that Rwanda was historically colonised by Belgium, but the way the Western, in general, Western news agencies reported the Rwandan genocide gave very little information about the colonial background of Belgium, yeah? In order to write the West out of the story, when the West is the story in this case. The reason that the genocide happened in Rwanda in 1994, sorry, not 97, is the direct or indirect result of colonial brutality. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So before we look at some examples and watch a clip, another way of understanding the two extremes of foreign correspondent reporting from a British perspective, or at least a European perspective, is that both the famous figures of Winston Churchill and Karl Marx were foreign correspondents. So Winston Churchill, before he became a prominent politician, before he became Prime Minister of his country, he was a foreign correspondent, very much highly educated, elite educated, like a BBC objective foreign correspondent. And Karl Marx worked for a German newspaper reporting revolutionary political uprisings in Europe. And they had completely different approaches. So Churchill is very much the establishment objective approach. Karl Marx is the political subjective approach. Very, very different, but they're both ostensibly doing the same job. They are being foreign correspondents. So we've talked about primary definers. Early Western foreign correspondents were colonial primary definers. Don't forget that the job of a foreign correspondent is a very important job, or at least that's what we're told, in that they are writing a draft of history. Their job is to report history as it happens, but if you're an objective foreign correspondent, what the idea is that you know that this is such an important event that you're writing history as it happens. Yeah? Which is quite if you think about it, for an individual or an individual institution like the BBC to be able to report history as it happens is quite a big claim, isn't it? Yeah? And it's also quite a big claim for John Pilger to fly to countries around the world where there are civil war and to say, I'm representing the people who are against the power in this particular country. These are big claims that foreign correspondents make. So early foreign correspondents were reporters of war and violence inflicted on Asian, African and South American people and their physical and mental and cultural worlds. Don't forget that history, i.e. objective foreign correspondence, is written by the winners of the war. We've already talked about how objectivity is the ideology of elite power of the ruling class. The victors of war deploy so-called objective journalists as secretaries, stenographers, writers to record history from the perspective of Western power. So in my research, foreign correspondents who don't conform to this, who refuse to act. So when I say stenographers, it means as an objective foreign correspondent, it's your job just to report what powerful people say and nothing more, right? Because they're powerful. It's a bit like just reporting what Donald Trump says and not questioning whether he's lying or not. That's the danger of objective foreign correspondence. Yeah? You don't look below the surface. Whereas John Pilger quite rightly points out that your job as a foreign correspondent is to check whether it's true, to find out the truth. But part of the problem in today's world is that very few foreign correspondents have the time, let alone the contacts or the energy, to find out what the truth is in a foreign country when a conflict breaks out. There's not time to do that. That's not a coincidence. So, in my research, foreign correspondents who don't conform to this, who refuse, like John Pilger, like Robert Fisk, who refuse to act as stenographers of power, they're criticised as being not professional, as being ideological, political, subjective, emotional, narcissistic. So when I show you a little bit of John Pilger's work and a little bit of the BBC in a moment, you can make up your own minds. Which one is objective? Which one is more emotional? Which one is more ideological? Yeah? I'm going to show you both schools of foreign correspondence. I'll show you a clip in a moment from The War You Don't See, but let's just look at this quotation that I think it kind of summarises John Pilger's view on foreign correspondent reporting. This is what he says about objectivity. I find reports, and you hear these a lot on the BBC, which cover itself with the nonsense that has risen to a nirvana means perfect place of objectivity, and therefore can operate from a perfect place of emotional reporting that highlights tragedy. Remember, tragedy being one of the paradigms that we talked about last week. That doesn't even begin to suggest why this tragedy has happened. I'm going to show you a clip of a BBC report of the Rwandan massacre, the genocide in '94. Does it tell you why it's happened? Yeah? Isn't it important to know why these things happen, not just that they've happened? And the problem is, from Pilger's perspective, if the report suggests why the genocide happened in Rwanda in '94, then it raises very, very difficult, embarrassing, and unpalatable questions about power. Often emotion is used to mask that, and John Pilger is very opposed to that. I think those who talk about black and white really like to deny. They do believe they've been touched by a higher authority in some ways that has stripped away human complexity and allowed them to see events objectively, impartially, without the slightest hint of bias or anything from their background entering into their thinking. That's absolute nonsense. So let's just watch a little clip now. I think I'm actually going to show you the BBC clip first, and then we come back to the two. John Simpson is probably the most prominent living British foreign correspondent working for the BBC, and Jeremy Bowen is the BBC Middle East editor. So I'm going to show you first of all how John Pilger talks about the Iraq War and how the Iraq War was reported as objectively in 2003. Let's watch that first. Bear with me. So for Pilger, the war you don't see is the war against people, yeah? Power against people.
This was the slaughter known as the First World War. 16 million died and 21 million were wounded. At the height of the carnage, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, had a private chat with the editor of The Guardian, C.P. Scott. If people really knew the truth, said the Prime Minister, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't know and can't know. The British public were desperate for real news. More than half the nation flocked to see an official propaganda film, The Battle of the Somme. Cameras were so unusual that young troops would shout, "Hello, Mum," as they marched to the front, and they were heard crying for their mothers as they died on the battlefield. This was almost never reported. These days we have 24-hour news. The soundbites never stop, and the wars never stop. Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine. This film is about the war you don't see. Drawing on my own experience as a war correspondent, it will look mainly at television, concentrating on the most popular channels in America and Britain. The film will ask, what is the role of the media in rapacious wars like Iraq and Afghanistan? Why do many journalists beat the drums of war, regardless of the lies of governments? And how are the crimes of war reported and justified when there are crimes? A pioneer of modern propaganda was this man, Edward Bernays. Bernays invented the term public relations. He wrote, "The intelligent manipulation of the masses is an invisible government which is the true ruling power in our country."
So what he's saying is that there is an invisible government in the media that uses psychological assumptions and theories to control what people think. If you control what people think, you control what they do. So it's no coincidence that the public relations industry in America uses psychological, psychoanalytic techniques that were documented and researched by Sigmund Freud. Yeah? Public relations is part of news reporting. Yeah? It's not separate. Advertising in a commercial news context is not separate from foreign correspondent reporting. Yeah? How you report a war does depend on, whether you think the war is a good thing or not. Yeah?
Part of a secretive group called the US Committee on Public Information, set up in 1917 to persuade reluctant Americans to join the war in Europe.
Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann go to Woodrow Wilson and say, "Look, man, if you're going to enter into this war, we are going to need to sell this war to the American people." And so Wilson institutes and creates the first modern propaganda machinery. It was actually quite brilliant in its conceptualization, so that the best way to persuade people is to grab them by their emotions, by their unconscious and instinctual urges. Let's not bother with pumping out facts. Let's scare the hell out of people. A picture of the Statue of Liberty in tatters, crumbled into the New York harbor with German planes flying around it. A picture of the world being gobbled up by the bloody hands of a gorilla wearing a German helmet. So, it's not about facts anymore. The facts don't matter.
For Edward Bernays, public relations was like a war on people, on bending their will. He persuaded women to smoke at a time when smoking in public was not considered ladylike.
Just going to jump forward a
He
tiny bit
convinced a
to
group
the Iraq War. That's
Saddam Hussein and 9/11. Iraq, March the 20th, 2003. The creation of illusions and the selling of war had come a long way since Edward Bernays. The selling of this invasion depended on the news media to promote a series of illusions, like the link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11.
The vision of the World War I poster of the Statue of Liberty in a shambles in New York Harbor is not that different from the image of the World Trade Center, a burning symbol that sort of entered into the stock footage of people's dreams. So immediately you have these associations between the image of the World Trade Center and Saddam Hussein and Iraq.
But Saddam Hussein had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it, but that didn't matter. Because when you start using symbols that have been separated from their meaning and have sort of taken on a life of their own, the facts don't matter anymore.
This is the Pentagon, which spends almost $1 billion
and doing our reporting.
Okay, there isn't time to go into this in any more detail, but we will talk about it more in the seminars. So basically, here's the argument once more, in a nutshell, that the Iraq War was reported objectively by public service news institutions like the BBC and commercial news institutions as a good thing. It was sold like it was a product to the people. This is a good thing, we need to do it. And it was done on misinformation. Many of the journalists you'll see in the documentary that John Pilger interviews actually say that they didn't do their jobs properly. They did not check whether Saddam Hussein actually had weapons of mass destruction. Because in the name of objectivity, they just trusted what the Western powers said, in particular Britain and America. Yeah? They said, you know, the American government says there's evidence that he has these weapons of mass destruction. That's the news, and that's a good pretext to attack Iraq. Yeah? And John Pilger at the time was one of these exceptional journalists who knew from his experience of being somebody who doesn't work for a commercial institution or the BBC, who's an independent foreign correspondent. He knew that this was a story that was being manufactured. Consent was being manufactured for an illegal war in the Middle East. Right? So I'm going to, there's just time now to show you a BBC example. Now, bear in mind that what I've shown you is a documentary. It's not foreign correspondent reporting, but it's a documentary about foreign correspondence. So you have a sense of what John Pilger thinks about foreign correspondence. You have a sense from the quotation, you have a sense from what I've just shown you in the documentary clip. So now I'm going to show you a BBC clip of Fergal Keane reporting the Rwandan genocide in 1994. It's very, very short, but just when you're watching this, just think to yourselves, okay, if you don't know anything about Rwanda and you were watching it in 94, based on the information you're given, what does it give you all the historical information you need about why this genocide has taken place, or does it just give you a lot of emotion? Yeah? And compare that, and that's done by a BBC foreign correspondent, right? And compare that with what John Pilger is saying about how emotion is used to stop facts, to stop context, to stop history being reported, real history.
time and the former Yugoslavia.
The last few hundred steps, South Africans put on a festival of
They started dancing as
days around 800,000.
soon as their new state president did. Hours after he left the stage, they look as if they'll keep going all night.
But while South Africa voted, in Rwanda there was genocide. In 100 days, around 800,000 people were killed.
As we approached the church at Nyarabuye, Frank became silent. He had been here before and knew what lay ahead. I had seen war before, had seen the face of cruelty, but Nyarabuye belonged in a nightmare zone, where my capacity to understand, to rationalize, was overwhelmed. The victims, all of them Tutsis, had gone to the church in search of sanctuary. Instead, the house of God became a killing ground.
Okay, so that's an example of BBC foreign correspondent reporting of the Rwandan genocide. What do you think that was objective or not?
No, it looked kind of emotional. Like the images are very explicit. They're not talking about history. They're not talking what was the background. They're just talking about like something that could like shock us.
I think you're absolutely right. I think shock is a big part of it. It's absolutely shocking. I can see it on your faces as you watch it. You're like, wow, why is he showing this? This is really shocking. Yeah. In a way, that's part of objectivity. That's what war is like. That's what war looks like. And one of the arguments that's given about, why there is a relationship between media and war is that if people really understood how brutal and disgusting and violent war is, there would be less war. So in that sense, it's quite moral. But you're quite right. No historical context, no mention of the history of Belgian colonialism and so on and so forth. And most people won't know that. So what will they think about this story about Africa? What does that make people think about Africa?
Scary, and there's insecurity.
They're just savages that kill each other.
Yeah.
Yeah? That's the colonial perspective. Right? Now it's not Fergal Keen's fault. Yeah? It's not his fault. He's giving you, this is what it feels like to be there. He's a human being. He's shocked. So he's overcome by emotion. He's one of my interviewees and he talks about this, how, he was traumatized. So that when he gave this report, he didn't know, he didn't have time and he didn't have he wasn't calm enough to find out the historical facts. He was actually very overwhelmed by this himself. But I'm going to show you, just at the end of today's lecture, a clip by another foreign correspondent who's called Jeremy Bowen, this is another news report that took place in '94 about the first democratic election in South Africa and the election of Nelson Mandela. And again, I want you to ask the same questions again. Is this example of a BBC foreign correspondent report, is it objective or is it more objective than the Fergal Keen one? Why or why not? So let's just take a quick look at that one.
After so much and so many years,
faithful to the Republic
a People's Park.
We're afraid that there's plenty of problems, but the difference now
In Johannesburg, the work
Them suffocate the apartheid state.
and the former Yugoslavia. And now we're dealing with something completely new, the war on terror. I had the privilege of seeing some of these historic events unfolding at first hand, like the first democratic elections in South Africa.
The last few hundred steps of South Africa's long march to freedom were taken at shuffling pace. South Africans queued to vote in their first democratic election. I watched them suffocate the apartheid state with their ballot papers.
Today, it's a new South Africa. It's a beginning of a new South Africa. we are going to have everything that we were deprived of.
In Johannesburg, the worst thing about voting was the waiting. 5 hours in this queue.
Some people have waited all their lives to put their cross. But it doesn't matter how long it takes, they are going to make their mark.
These elections are as important for Africa as the collapse of communism was for Europe. This country still has plenty of problems, but the difference now is that a democratically elected non-racial government will be dealing with them.
We come to South Africa expecting a civil war. Nelson Mandela put on a festival of reconciliation instead.
Down below, they waited and turned the lawns of the Union buildings into a people's park.
It's a great day in our lives. It means freedom for us. Freedom at last.
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
Will you please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God"?
So help me God.
They released doves of peace. It was time to celebrate and to hope. After so much and so many years, the people of South Africa have spoken. It was a generous and a happy day. They started dancing as soon as their new state president did. Hours after he left the stage, they look as if they'll keep going all night.
Okay, how about that one? Objective? Very different from the Fergal Keane one in terms. Think about the emotion in that. It's positive, isn't it? It's factual, it's history, it happened. Yeah? Does it give you historical background? Does it give you context? Does it give you facts compared to the Fergal Keane Rwanda clip? It does, doesn't it? So in that sense, it's more objective. Yeah? Can you think of any reason why this news story, I mean, actually in terms of news values, it hasn't got any negativity. Yeah? I think it's the only thing about this story that makes it a little bit not objective and a little bit unbalanced is it's a celebration. It's like, this is great, democracy is coming to Africa, which of course is what we all wanted to feel at the time, and it was an amazing moment for the whole world, especially South Africans. But there were problems associated with Nelson Mandela coming to power, because part of him coming to power politically was that he was opening South Africa up to capitalism and Western foreign direct investment, which has led to South Africa actually regressing and getting worse socially, and crime rates, and even apartheid is still a bit of an issue in South Africa today. Yeah? So maybe, just maybe, this Western foreign correspondent, Jeremy Bowen, was a little bit biased because it was Western values in Africa. Yeah? Democracy is coming to Africa. And another example of that is the way, for our Chinese friends here, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre was reported by BBC foreign correspondents such as John Simpson and Kate Adie. They reported the massacre of the students in Tiananmen Square in 1989 like, they said quite rightly that the students were victims of a very violent Chinese government, yeah? But part of the reason they did that was because they were saying these students want democracy, they want Western values. And again, I've interviewed John Simpson about this and he's talked about it on the record. He knows that when he reported the 1989 massacre of students in Tiananmen Square, he lost his objectivity. Yeah, because he felt so sorry for the pro-democracy students that were quite right, why shouldn't he feel sorry, were being killed in cold blood by their own government. But what the BBC report didn't do, and probably should have done in the name of objectivity, is at least they should have presented the perspective of the Chinese government, because from the perspective of the Chinese government, I'm not justifying the violence, they are, was that this was the beginning of a civil war, that the whole of China was about to collapse, and they had to stop the uprising violently. Yeah? But there's another case of where, in so-called British foreign correspondent reporting, BBC reporters like Jeremy Bowen in Rwanda, like John Simpson in China, they lose their objectivity when they're reporting a political group that has Western values in the foreign country. They lose the balance. How did the Chinese mainstream news report the Tiananmen Square massacre? Well, the way they did it, typically in a very propagandist fashion, was that they, some of you will remember if you've seen the images, there was a very famous image of a protester standing in front of a tank in order to stop the tank, and the tank stopped. And of course you can say that's a very, very brave protester, and that's how Simpson would have seen it. It's like, he was putting his life on the line. But the way the Chinese newspapers and TV reported was how brave the soldier, the driver of the tank, was not to kill the student. Yeah? Which is another interesting way of thinking about it, because you'd never get that from the BBC report, would you? You'd never see it that way, what it's like to be from the Chinese perspective, from the Chinese government perspective. So it's complex. What I'm trying to say through these stereotypes of John Simpson and John Pilger, yeah, political subjectivity and objectivity, is actually it's complex. Yeah? And the two British foreign correspondents, the BBC ones, Fergal Keenan and Jeremy Bowen, they're both working for the BBC, but they have completely different approaches to their job. One is more emotional and arguably more objective, because he's telling us what it feels like when these stories happen. Yeah? And the other ones, like John Simpson, Jeremy Bowen, are much more stereotypically dry, clipped, unemotional. But they're both examples of foreign correspondent reporting. So emotion plays a very important role in foreign correspondent reporting. I'm sorry if I've rushed a lot of information. There's a lot of information in this lecture. It's very hard for me to give this lecture without, talking about things that I know about, and I recognise that you don't have the same background, but I think there's something very interesting going on in British foreign correspondence that I'd like to talk to you more about in the seminars. Okay? So we'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.